Let's finally, and I'll go a little bit faster because we're a bit behind schedule, but let's take a look at the archaeology. So I had a look at some funerary rites from Frisia to see what information can be gleaned there. For that, I looked at 3 main cemeteries. So the cemetery of Oostgeest, which is in South Holland, very fun one to pronounce. We can all try that at the pub later. There are 2 from Friesland. There is one from Eersterbeintum, Oosterbeintum in Dutch, and Heerebeintum, which is Hoogbeintum in Dutch. And then try to compare what we saw there. So what is it that we see in the funerary rites? So we see that there is both inhumation and cremation burial, and there is no clear pattern to age, gender, and social status. So what I mean there is that we don't see that it is only women that are created and men that are buried, let's say. It is pretty much all through each other. It's very random, quite similar to what we find in Scandinavia around the same time, that there isn't a clear way that someone is to be buried. It's very diverse. What's also varied is the positions in which the deceased are placed, especially if we compare that with the later Christian burials. Some are on their backs, some have their knees crossed, others are in crouched positions, and some are in such weird positions that archaeologists have called them deviant burials. And they may have been criminals in life, they may have been foreigners, is another thing that's been suggested based on some of the DNA evidence that has gone with it, and maybe they were just incredibly quirky individuals. We don't really know, but that's the fun with funerary rites. So we frequently find grave goods that are also alongside. Around half of those that I looked at had grave goods with them, and these are often typified on the basis of the sex of the deceased. So a lot of the time we will find jewelry that is associated with women, with them fibulae, for example, and brooches like the Domburg type, as well as spindle whorls. Of course, spinning was incredibly important, and later Frisian law gives a very high fine to someone who harms a person who is involved in spinning wool, i.e. most of the time a woman. So clearly that was incredibly important, and these were things that followed them into the grave. We have a few examples though where the sex of the individual does not line up with the grave good that they are given. And based on some of the comparative approaches by looking at Scandinavia, this transgression of the traditional gender role with what they were given perhaps indicates that they had a religious role in life, thinking especially about save and other such things. But again, it's hard to tell based on the quite scant evidence that we have. It's worth bearing in mind that because of the soil conditions of the Netherlands with frequent flooding, these cemeteries often aren't incredibly well preserved. The Terpen, these hills that were piled up, were incredibly fertile farmland. And in the 19th century, the Frisian farmers found out and they thought, hey, this is brilliant. They started to excavate them, to use them as fertilizer on their own farmland, which was great for them. But they started to pull out all of these old things. So we have a lot of these, they didn't really know what to do with them. So a lot of them have disappeared. A lot of the finds that we know were once there, we don't have anymore, or we don't know what their find contexts were like. So it's often rather difficult to work with the material. One particularly interesting thing for Frisia is that we have horse and dog burials. Now, these are frequently buried alongside humans. The horses were almost always stallions. They were almost always in the primes of their lives. So perhaps we can suggest that these were sacrifices. They weren't old mares or nags, as you might call them, which had sort of dropped off and then they chucked them in the grave. These were probably part of some rite that was part of the dead. But, and for any dog lovers, you'll be pleased to hear, most of the dogs were quite large, and actually going on a bit of a tangent, but a later Old Frisian law code has 5 ranks of dogs, depending on how much weregild you have to pay if you harm such a dog. It ranges from dogs that can kill wolves to dogs that lie around the farm and don't do anything and aren't particularly useful. But anyway, but these dogs, most of them are quite old. So it suggests that these may have been the kind of pets or the animals of the individuals that died, and that when they died, they were also put with their human. So that's quite nice. But what does this tell us about beliefs in the afterlife and potential spiritual beliefs? It's quite hard to say. The dead don't bury themselves. And as Connor mentioned for St. Cuthbert, we're not entirely sure whether we're looking at something that we should call religious, or is this something that is cultural? That this is a cultural tradition and that the horses and dogs that are buried have no religious significance, but rather it's to show the social status of the person who was buried, rather than that they believed that there was some kind of religious symbolism behind it or purpose. However, what I will say is that it's very interesting that we find grave goods alongside them. The kinds of grave goods are also enlightening, and the fact that we find animals buried alongside them, as we find, of course, in the old Frisian law codes, these dogs could be very useful. They could be taken into battle, they could defend livestock against wolves, or they could lie around on the farm being not particularly useful. But it may suggest that these were objects that people were expected to need in a second life that they might have. If we're looking at combs, knives, spindle whorls for spinning, gaming pieces, etc., these are things that suggest that it isn't just a soul that goes on into the next life. It is a body, because why would you have a comb if you don't have hair to comb with? Unless, of course, it is rather not a religious thing, but a social thing. However, I think that seems unlikely, given the effort that was put into a lot of these. So an interesting facet of Frisian burials is that we do have a few ship burials. Unluckily for us, we don't have any huge royal boat burials like at Sutton Hoo and places in Scandinavia. However, we do have some smaller ones. So we know of one from Sollefeld near Den Haag, and we have two from East-Friesland, you'll be happy to hear, from Dunham and Falvert. These are more like rowing boats, and they are then covered over with planks, the deceased being placed inside. We also have half a dugout canoe from a burial in Jemgum, which is in West-Friesland. And we have one of the Heegebeinten burials, which we unfortunately no longer have because it was excavated in 1905, around then. That was also said to have been in a boat-shaped coffin, which is also a rather interesting little allusion. Another piece of evidence for this is that 17 out of the 42 nails from Eersterbeintum were clinches. And clinches are a kind of rivet that is used on a ship to make sure that I believe it's that the hull can actually endure the force of the waves crashing against it. So an essential part of a ship. So why are they burying people in ships here? Well, a lot has been said, obviously, about ship burials in England and in Scandinavia. Some thoughts about the Frisian examples, because none of them are large royal ships with slaves and animals chucked in. They are simply a person in a rather small ship that has been buried. Perhaps it's the case that they need some kind of transportation to get to where they're going next. Or is it because they might be coming back? We know from later Icelandic sources that when it comes to grave mounds, that sometimes people would sit or lie down upon grave mounds and that the dead would communicate with them and give them information they wanted. Is it possible that such boats were meant to be so that the dead may sometimes return and be of use to their community? It's hard to say, but it's an interesting idea. We also have from Oostgeest a very interesting case where we have secondary deposits. So primary deposit is the first time something goes into the ground. Secondary means that it has either been dug up once again and then buried again. We also find similar parallels with the Norse funerary ritual, especially if you read Price, he goes into some detail about that. But what is very interesting is that we also get secondary deposits from Oostgeest that have not actually been buried at all, but they've been excarnated. An excarnation is when you let the body decompose above ground. Now, even more interesting, in my opinion, is that we also have signs of scavenging marks by carnivores and by birds, indicating that these animals, that these bodies have been left to be picked clean by various animals. And the types of wounds that we see on these bones, obviously after they've already died, are peck marks. So probably from crows and other carrion, as well as the bite marks of various carnivores, possibly wolves, foxes, dogs, that sort of thing. And it's possible this is related to the Germanic idea of the beasts of battle, which are described as appearing before a battle. There are many kennings which go into feeding the ravens or the wolves preparing to feast, that kind of thing. So could it be that these animals, the wolves and the ravens, which, as Tom mentioned in his talk, are very much associated with the god Odin, are perhaps part of a specialized funerary rite that is reserved for warriors? Particularly intriguing is that those secondary deposit bones that show signs of excarnation are all from young men. So perhaps it is something that is associated not necessarily with the warrior, but with young men in general. Or perhaps are we seeing evidence of the prior Iron Age rite of excarnation instead? It should be mentioned that so before we have that mass exodus out of the Terpen area following the Roman period, we know of no burials from that time, but we know that there were people there. So is it possible that the reason we don't have any burials from that period is because they aren't burying people, but they're leaving them above ground? We know, for instance, from places like Tibet, Mongolia, various Native American tribes, that certain social groups are also excarnated instead of being buried. So it's an intriguing possibility that we don't know the answer to, but there are several possible options there. I'm going to go really quickly through material culture so that we can get on to Jonathan. A lot of this is based on the excellent work of Johann Nicolai into metalwork and kingship in Frisia. And what we see if we look at some of these brooches from Friesland is that we can make out a face there. And we can actually also make out another face here. And what you can see is if you compare the size of the eyes is that all the time one of the eyes is larger than the other, perhaps giving a one-eyed depiction of this face. Around the eyes we get several beasts. These are mostly horses that we can see. And we get, again, more beast faces on the footplate here on this brooch too. There are several examples of this that come out of the ground. Sometimes these animals look like horses, other times they look like birds or wolves or serpentine creatures that we see. But very frequently we get this idea of a face and then several animal heads around them or animal bodies. The same is true for bracteates, which we also get in large abundance in Frisia. Many of them are based on examples from Scandinavia, others are more similar to those in Anglo-Saxon England, showing their contact there. What's very interesting about these bracteates, however, is that they often show animals, mostly a horse with a face. And while this face was probably originally based on that of a Roman emperor, it has changed somewhat by this period. What's interesting about this example is that you can see there is a man with a pretty funky hairdo, some kind of mullet, I think, riding on a horse, but that if you've ever seen a horse, that is not what horses' hooves look like, but it is how they depict human feet at this point. So we have a human head on top of a horse with human feet, and if you can see there, I'm not sure how clear it is, but you can see that the horse's mouth is open, and on quite a few the tongue is also lolling out. So how this has been interpreted is that this is an image probably of the god Odin, probably called Woden at that point in Frisia, that is becoming an animal. And that this man between beast motif, as it's described, having that face between various animals, and of course in the metal it all sort of blurs together, might be the case that we're seeing something shamanic, where a man is becoming an animal in various rituals that we see. So Nicolai echoes Olson's study into Odinic symbolism here about migration period metalwork. And he believes that these animals that are depicted are Odin's familiars, and that the reason why the horse's tongue is lolling out, and why we saw in Tom's presentation the two birds that are sort of, they appear to be leaning in. We saw in Petter's presentation on the seat, you can see the female looking figure. There were also two ravens on the arm rests that are also sort of bent in as if they are speaking to the person. Is it the case that they are getting divine knowledge from these animals, that they are able to communicate with people, just as we read about in the story of the Volsungs, when Sigurd, he eats the heart of Fafnir, and then he is able to understand the language of birds. Very interesting, and these are possibilities that this is what's being shown on the metalwork. These are Domburg brooches, so typically Frisian brooches, probably worn by women. And the point I wanted to make here is, again, we have that symbolism of the two birds that are leaning in, but as time goes on, we stop seeing so clearly the lines of two birds, and they basically just sort of create the basic shape. They don't really care about the birds at that point. Here are some beautiful examples again from the Frisian Terpen area. We have again this idea that there are faces and animals between, but as time goes on, the actual animal becomes less important and it becomes more stylistic. with various swirls there. But with this very fancy graphic, I just wanted to show that if we flip it on its head, we can again see some kind of face. Obviously, there we do have something in the eye, there we don't, and with a mustache underneath. So that may be, again, Odinic symbolism. This is interesting. It's found at Ellsfleth in Lower Saxony, so quite close to the border with Frisia. This is likely Frankish work, probably depicting Christ. But if we zoom in, we can see that the niello fill of the eye has been carefully removed to make it one-eyed. So here we have literally Christ becoming Odin in this way to perhaps make it more suitable for people in this area who were pagans at that time. Very interesting piece of metalwork. So to move quickly forward, what are we seeing on the metalwork? Well, I would posit, as others have done as well, that we may split it between various social orders. That for the upper nobility, the royals in Frisia, the mythological significance relating to Woden and possibly to specific myths that were no doubt being told in their halls by their skalds, as we read in Beowulf, that this was very important, that relation to Woden, the god of the lords. The ancestral connection with Scandinavia, as well as the contemporary shared connections, were also incredibly important and were being expressed through the material culture. So we have both the importance of religion and cultural affinity. But for the local elites, the lower nobility that were making these debased domburg brooches, where you can't actually tell what is being depicted, it's just the basic shape, then it's a visual representation of the personal bond between a patron and the king, rather than a religious symbol. So the symbolism on the jewelry isn't important. It's rather the marker of the political affiliation. So this is very interesting because it shows that various elements of the pre-Christian religion may have been important to different people, and perhaps not everyone was allowed in on the secret of the mythology, that perhaps divine knowledge was also kept to a certain group and that they had a certain afterlife to which they would go, hence that they would have a certain funerary ritual. And that for other classes in the society, so those poor individuals that Redbot didn't want to be with in the afterlife, that something else was due for them. It's possible. Can we know anything about the very lowest classes and what they believed in? Well, possibly by looking at certain magical objects. I was about to say omelets, but that's not what we're looking at here. We have some amulets, though, and some charms. We find tooth amulets, especially those of dogs and wolves' teeth, which have been found. And interestingly, they seem to be connected with children a lot of the time. And it's thought that there's a possible connection with trying to ward off sickness in children by giving them a wolf's tooth. We also find discs of red deer antler, which also may have been connected with fertility, as these red deer antler were often hung outside of apothecaries in the later Middle Ages, and from the Roman time, we know that they also had a connection with fertility, so maybe this was something that was quite important for women at the time. Speaking of which, we also have a shell from we don't find these shells at all in the Frisian coastal area, so it's probably traded up from the Mediterranean. This was found on a woman's forehead in a grave at Fervert. And we may connect this shell with ethnographic examples from southern Italy. So in Sicily, still in the 19th century, women were wearing amulets with the exact same kinds of shell around their necks. And that was because they thought that it would make them more fertile and protect them in childbirth. We also have a few other examples of these shells being used in similar ways in Northern Europe at the time when the woman of Fervet was alive. So it's possible that that's what's going on here, because the shell itself, when held in a certain way, looks just like a vulva. So perhaps that's what they're trying to emulate by wearing such a thing. We also have a very curious little bronze box that may have contained herbs and appears to have been something that could be worn around the neck, although of course that can have other functions too. So let's race towards the conclusions here. What can we conclude about religion in Frisia at this time? Well, we know from the textual sources of the hagiographies that shrines were very important places. There were special rules that applied here and which were protected by law, in this case by the king, by Redbot, or at least the authority of the land. So place name evidence certainly suggests that there were many of these shrines around. But archaeologically, we don't have any evidence for large temples or lots of sacrifice like the oxen skulls from Iceland and other places. We simply don't have it. So it's possible that whatever rites were being performed there were archaeologically invisible and that we therefore don't have them. It's also very likely, I think at least, that these would be quite minimalist rather than necessarily being grand structures anyway. So we're not sure what to look for in that case, but I think they were likely important central places. The lord or the king played an important role in the religious cult, as he was tasked with the protection of the shrines as the giver of the law, and the law obviously included that shrines had to be protected. And we can assume also that he oversaw the religious ceremonies that occurred at the time. That's certainly the impression we get from the Vita Wolframi, if it can be believed. The symbolism in artwork, the choice of funerary rites, and the understanding of the social position, we can understand that the religious and the secular were tightly bound together, that probably we aren't looking for a separate priest class in this case, but rather members of the secular elite that were the purveyors of this knowledge. From the funerary rites, we get the idea that this is a non-dogmatic approach to death, and I would extend that the religion also had a non-dogmatic approach to life, where there wasn't a sacred text or a kind of something to draw on that had all the answers. Rather that it was more diverse. Perhaps we can look at regional differences. Of course, Oostgeest in South Holland is an area where there was more settlement continuation from the Roman period to later. So perhaps they had a different funerary rite with the excarnation. It's possible that's an explanation for that. The inclusion of animals in the graves I find also very interesting, because it says something about their idea of what happens in the afterlife. Although whether we interpret that as being solely religious or as more a marker of social status is just the question. And by looking at the jewelry, we can see how these ideas developed and how possibly different things were important for different people in different social groups at that time. It would suggest by looking at this jewelry that the distinction between human, animal, and divine is literally blurring within the metalwork. And I would argue that by including horses and dogs in graves, you're also doing the same when it comes to the funerary rite and the afterlife, which is quite interesting. The idea that one could use teeth of various animals or antlers and shell amulets to give a certain boon to people and to harness some kind of desired power that these animals have may suggest that they also believed in some kind of animism, that there was a soul in various objects that we would class as being inanimate, or otherwise why wear them? But as with many of these things, they raise more questions than we have answers. But I hope I was able to give a few answers to you all today. So thank you very much for listening.